This will be a retelling of the memoir called The Life, Crimes, and Confessions of Clifton Branham. We have a lot of information concerning Clifton Branham's life according to the newspaper articles of the time in our Killing Rock series. Both of the links of the article and video are available in the description box below. We are able to retell this story because it was written before September 25, 1903 by Clifton Branham and printed just after his death. As with all memoirs and autobiographies, please take them with a huge grain of salt, as no one wants to think of themselves as a villain or antihero in their own stories. We wish to thank the creators of Potter's website, which is linked down below under Yapot. Thank you for your tireless work in keeping our history alive. We also wish to thank Steve Fleming for talking to us about Clifton and sharing information between us. It is people like you that we learn a great deal from. We will use the pictures of the places that these events took place in if we do not have pictures of the people available. The picture that we have of Clifton Branham is from the Find a Grave website. It was a contribution of Steve Fleming. Another piece of housekeeping. What is known today as Pine Mountain was called Cumberland Mountain at that time. It would be renamed at a later time in history. All aboard the Kentucky-Tennessee Living Time Machine. Please fasten your seatbelts and keep your arms and legs inside of the vehicle at all times. But to get going, we need your help. We still need to fire up the time machine to transport us. Please help us by clicking the like, subscribe, and bell notification buttons down below. Not only does this fire up the time machine, but it convinces YouTube that we need a bigger time machine to reach more people who love history as much as you do. Now, back to our story. Clifton's information. Clifton Branham was born in 1861 in Cabin Branch in Letcher County, Kentucky. His parents were John C. Branham and Mahalia Mosley. He had several siblings: Elizabeth Branham Mullet, 1843 to 1916, Joseph Branham, 1845 to 1934, Richard Branham, 1847 to 1932, Charity Branham Moore, 1847 to 1929, Adeline Branham Cox, 1853 to unknown, Millie Branham Cox, 1860 to 1949, Polly Branham Johnson, 1866 to 1953. There is historically one other sibling, Tandy Branham, listed with Clifton, but he could have been a half-sibling or not recorded in some sources. He also has an uncle named Tandy Branham, and the two are not to be confused. Branham would marry his cousin, Nancy J., against her mother's wishes on May 23, 1880, in Wise, Virginia. Nancy was born November 15, 1861, in Pound, Virginia. Clifton states that they were only 1 month apart in age, but we still don't have a date of birth for him. They would have 3 children together: Ida Branham Taylor, 1881 through 1974, Judge W. Branham, 1884 to 1865, and Elizabeth Branham Warwick, 1886 to 1925. Meenma would be born to the marriage but would die at the age of 3. Ida would marry David Fleming. George would marry Maggie Vanover. Branham would become the last man hanged in Wise County, Virginia on September 25, 1903, in the murder of his wife, Nancy. This writing comes from the time that Clifton was awaiting his execution at the Wise County Jail in Virginia. Now, for the writings of Clifton Branham. The early years. Clifton begins his writing by speaking about how he was born in 1861 on Cabin Branch in Letcher County. His father was a farmer by trade. Both parents were members of the local Baptist church. His family moved to Dorton Creek in Pike County, Kentucky, the year that the Civil War had broken out. They continued to live there during the war years, and Branham speaks about seeing soldiers moving through the mountains. 2 of Clifton's brothers and father, John, fought during the war. His father was captured and taken to Camp Chase and did not return until after the war was finished. By that time, Mahalia had taken her children to north of Cumberland Mountain, near Elkhorn Creek, to live. Mahalia had a hard time raising her children on her own during the war and had to be away from them weekly until Clifton was 10 years old. Clifton says at first his mother did not recognize his father upon his return, but when she did, they had a happy reunion. His brothers and sisters began to marry and leave home during this time, and they lived in this home for several years. They moved to Beefide for a while, with only Clifton and his two younger sisters still at home. Then John bought a place on Owl Branch and built a cabin on it. Branham describes it as, quote, where the base was partially laid and the chimney was up to the mantel. When Father and I moved in, there was not a, and this is too dim to make out the words, and I was now 12 years old and fond of a gun. We would work all week until Saturday afternoon when my father and I squirrel hunted and my little feet would roam the mountains in search of game, never thinking that anything would ever befall me, nor did I ever think of harming anyone, unquote. Clifton leaves home. After helping build the house, Clifton said that he felt that his father was not being very fair to him. He left home and went to Johnson County, Kentucky, to live with a brother and two sisters. He had to travel 80 miles to get to his destination. The first day on the journey started out very well until evening came. Branham came to the first place to stay the night. The people refused to let him stay. By the time he got to the second place to ask for a place to stay, it was almost dark and it was raining. When Clifton asked the man if he could stay the night, he slammed the door on him and made no further answer. In the dark, Branham states that he finally made his way to a barn and spent the night in a loft. He talks about how it had been raining all night and into the morning when he starts out on his journey again. The banks of the creek had flooded at that point. He went across the creek between two poles when he fell into a hole that he could not reach the bottom of. He grabbed one of the poles to help him cross the water. When he reached the other side, it began to snow. Cold and wet, Clifton continued onward in his journey. He came to another house in which the young man asked him to come in and warm up by the fire. They were eating breakfast and asked Branham if he wanted a plate. He told them that he had no money to give them, but the man of the house said that it would not matter. So Clifton ate breakfast while warming up by the fireplace. After Clifton had dried out, the man showed him the best route to go to his destination. By the end of the day, Clifton had reached his brother's house. He then began working for himself and lived there for 4 years. Clifton meets Nan. While Clifton was away, John Branham bought a piece of land on top of Cumberland Mountain and built a house there. Branham talks about how he had some kinfolk that lived on the south side of the Pound River and decided that he would go pay them a visit. When he was just 16 years old, he went to his cousin Martin Branham's home place to stay for a time. While he was there, he knew that Tandy Branham's family lived nearby. Tandy had been killed during the Civil War, and he left behind his widow and 7 children. There were 3 children still left in the home because the rest had married and moved away. While visiting with Martin, he met Nancy and thought that she was the prettiest girl in the world. They were only a month apart in age. Right then and there, Clifton was determined to marry Nancy no matter what. It seemed that both Nancy and Clifton were both struck by Cupid's arrow, and that they felt the same way about each other. However, her mother, Martha Elizabeth Robertson Branham, and her brother Wilburn refused the match and forbade the two from speaking to each other. This was because there was a well-to-do farmer by the name of Mullins from Dickinson County that Nancy had been talking to. Martha wanted Nancy to marry him as her chances for a better life with him would have been improved. However, Clifton and Nancy had talked to each other on the sly behind their back. Martha hired Clifton as a hired hand around her place for a month. She did so because he was a good worker, and Clifton agreed because he wanted to be around Nancy. As it turns out, Martha was often absent from the home, and Nancy was left with Clifton unsupervised on the farm. Nancy would call him to dinner about 11 o'clock, and they would spend 2 hours happily chatting away. Then Clifton would go back to work on the farm. During this time, Nancy told Clifton that she would agree to be his wife. Clifton and Nan elope. With marriage to Nan in his mind, Clifton asked Martha if she objected to their union. She stated that she did not want them to marry because he was so young and might be mean to her, as Clifton had an ill temper. She was afraid that he would end up killing her daughter in a fit of rage. Clifton promised that he would never be mean to Nan, but this did not sway Martha, as she said that even though he was a good worker, he was too hot-headed for her daughter and refused to budge. She also warned Clifton not to put it into his mind to steal Nan away, for if he did, it would be better if a millstone hanged around his neck and cast into the sea. Clifton said that she would be his wife or he would die. The next day Martha had to leave again, but she left Floyd Branham's wife in charge of Nan. She was Nancy's sister-in-law. Later in that day, she left the house as it was getting late. This left Nancy and Clifton alone in the house. Nancy said, quote, "Clifton, this is as good a time for us leaving as it will get," unquote. He agreed. Just as they started to leave, Clifton saw his father John walking down the road toward them. Clifton waved him on down the road. John walked a short distance and saw Martha and stopped her. Nancy and Clifton ran through the orchard and to their freedom. They crossed the river at Martin Branham's home and then on to James Peake's home to stay the night. Clifton states that he had felt like that he had captured the world, and he thought that Nancy was pure and a perfect girl. The next morning they went on toward the top of Cumberland Mountain and stopped at the house of Clifton's sister, who lived 1/2 mile from John. His younger sister wanted the couple to go with her to John's home. At first, Clifton refused this invitation on account of he was afraid that John would be mad at him for stealing away with Nancy. But John came to the sisters' home and told Clifton that it was not the case and all was well. So they went on to John's house and stayed there for some time. Nancy's younger brother, who was also named John, came to the house bringing the rest of Nancy's belongings and giving them a message from Martha. Martha told them that she was still not giving up on Nancy and that she would not give her consent for marriage. Clifton sent back a message to her telling her that all was all right because he had Nanny, and it was no use acting foolish. The couple stayed at John Branham's farm for the next couple of months. Martha then sent for the couple. Nan and Clifton went to Mr. Austin's house on the river and asked him to make sure that everything was okay. Mr. Austin returned after he made sure that peace had been made with Martha. Clifton then went to Wise County Courthouse in Wise, Virginia, and got the marriage license. He then came back and married Nan. They returned to John's house. Married life. Clifton speaks about this time with Nan as being the happiest on this earth. When he would leave for work and return, she would always greet him with kisses. Within a year, their first child was born. The couple moved twice by the time their baby had reached a year of age. They went to Johnson County, Kentucky to visit Clifton's sister, where they stayed until that spring. They took a boat on the Big Sandy River to Pikeville, where Clifton found a job with a man named Ford. After working for him for a time, the couple moved to La Vista Fork of the Big Sandy River and worked for Jeff Rowe. During that time, the couple had another baby. Then they moved to Shelby Creek and back to the Cumberland Mountain. They lived happily together for 8 years and had 4 children, one of whom was a little girl that died at the age of 3. Clifton speaks that he was a tough boy even though the Lord had been knocking at his heart. Nan belonged to the church. He laments that if he had been as good as his wife, then his life would have been far different. Conclusion. We will leave Clifton and Nan in their marriage for now. We can surmise at this point in the story that something had happened to the marriage of Clifton and Nan. The death of a child is extremely hard on parents, and it looks as if after the death of Mima that the happiness that the couple shared died along with their daughter. From this point onward, Clifton's personality changes, as he will soon turn to moonshining and a life of crime. By the way his memoir is written, he no longer stays at the same home with his wife, and later they have a fight that will lead to Nan's death over a daughter. It is really unclear if it is Mima that Nan is speaking of or Ida. We will see Nan and Clifton reconcile for a few months before the death of Henry Vanover, but after this point, their marriage has come to the point that it is now at an end. Moonshining. There came a time after the 8 years were over that Clifton, along with two other parties, began moonshining to make money. He does not name either party, but states at the time of his writings that one was living on the south side of the Cumberland Mountain and the other was dead. The trio did very well with their endeavors until they started to become afraid of the revenue officers. So they moved their operation to the head of the Kentucky River just above Mart Venter's home. They would make large quantities of shine. To do that, they would cut down a large chestnut tree to make their tubs with. The location was perfect to set up their steel. They would often go down to the house to play the violin, pick the banjo, and have a great time dancing. They thought that they were having a wonderful time, but soon this would all end. Rant, Smallwood. In our Outlaw series, we do have a story about the life of Clell Adams. It can be found on our video titled The Deadliest Deputy in Letcher County. The link is posted down below. According to the memoir by Clifton Branham, Clell was married to the stepdaughter of Mr. Venters. His brother-in-law was Rant or Rand Smallwood. We currently do not have her name or the date of their marriage, or if they had children. Rant killed Clell for $100 and an improved .38 Smith & Wesson pistol. Rant was a friend and old schoolmate of Branham. Smallwood and Branham had gotten on very well until he tried to kill Francisci, who was a friend of Branham. Another friend of Branham stated that, quote, "It would be a good thing if someone would kill Rant Smallwood," unquote. Being young and easily led astray, Branham decided to kill Smallwood himself. He went to Mark Vanover's house to get a gun, but a lady asked him what he wanted to do with the gun. When Clifton told her that he wanted to kill Smallwood with it, she took back the gun and said, quote, "Clifton, don't do that," unquote. So, unable to get the gun, Clifton took his Spencer rifle and a .44 caliber cap and ball Remington instead. Leaving the steel, Branham took to the brush and went to Blaze Branch and stayed all night with Wes Sowers. The next morning Clifton went by the woods to Dorton, Kentucky. There he found Rant working on a church house. Clifton concealed himself for a while, but could see no opportunity to shoot Rant. So he went back to the woods, crossing Shelby Creek, and went up to Dorton on top of the opposite hill. While spying on the men working on the church, there was still not an opportunity to shoot Rant. While he was watching the men work, a Fleming boy who was dodging the sheriff came to where he was. Clifton told him to send Rant a message to come to him. Rant sent a message back telling him to come with him. So Clifton went with Rant to his home to stay the night. The next day, Rant and Clifton went squirrel hunting twice. But there was still no opportunity to kill Rant that day. Rant tells Clifton about a dream he had. He said, quote, "Dreamed that a large snake got on him, and that he could not get it off," unquote. Clifton knew that the snake in the dream was him. That afternoon they decided to go to Wes Sowers' home to see his girls. They cleaned and oiled their guns before they headed out. Clifton knew that Rant had been watching him during their entire journey. When Clifton fell a step behind Rant, he said, quote, "Clifton, walk up to my side, for I believe you want to shoot me," unquote. To calm his nerves, Clifton told him that he was being foolish for thinking that way. Then Rant asked Clifton if someone was trying to shoot him in an ambush, what would Clifton do? Clifton replied that he would shoot as many of them as he could. The time came when they arrived at Mr. Soward's home, and soon after supper the old folks turned in and went to bed. Only the girls, Smallwood, and Branham were alone in the kitchen talking. Along about 8 or 9 o'clock at night, Clifton said that he had to go, and he got up and went outside. He then walked around, and he found a hole in the side of the house big enough for his gun muzzle. Smallwood was sitting just opposite of the hole in a chair leaned up against the wall. Clifton lined up the muzzle of his gun and shot Rant in the stomach. Rant stood up, fell face first, and said, quote, "Clifton Branham has killed me," unquote. Life on the run. Clifton left that same night and went to the head of Kentucky River to lay low. The news came to the post office the next day that someone had shot Smallwood and he was just alive. Clifton stayed there for a little while, and then he moved on to Pound, Virginia. He traveled to Pound by crossing the Cumberland Mountain at Horse Gap and came off at Elf Sour's Mill, just above Donkey. There he was once again told that Smallwood was shot and that he was being accused of the deed. Clifton denied that he had anything to do with it and claimed that his friends were looking out for him. Just as a precaution, Clifton went to the store and bought some powder, caps, lead, and filled his pockets full of bullets. And then he traveled to Granville Cox's home. Cox was his brother-in-law. Branham stayed with him for a couple of days. Clifton then traveled to Mr. Looney's home on Slate Creek in Buchanan County, Virginia. He spent a few days with Mr. Looney, and then word came that Branham had shot a man in Kentucky and was getting away. Looney asked for Clifton to stay with him a bit longer, but he left his house the next day. Branham traveled to Mr. Rife's home in McDowell County, West Virginia, and stayed with him until after Christmas with Mr. Mullins. Mr. Mullins was a clever moonshiner. After Christmas, Clifton was on the move again and went to Indian Creek in Tazewell County, Virginia. There he worked for a while for a Mr. Lambert, and he worked for a Mr. Moore. Other women. While on his travels, he used the name of George Jones and claimed that he was a single man. He claims to have fallen in love with a great many girls, widows, and married women. One of the married women had fallen in love with him and offered to have her husband put away, and she would give him all that she had if he would only stay with her. She had enough money to keep them both for the rest of their lives. It was during this time that Granville Cox came to Tazewell after Clifton, and together they returned home. Rant Smallwood was almost completely healed from his wounds. Clifton and his wife would go to John Branham's home for the next 2 months to live. What will happen next will put a permanent rift between Clifton and Nan, and will send Clifton to prison for the next 14 years of his life. Death of Henry Vanover. Clifton Branham had been living with his wife Nancy for the past couple of months on the property that was located at Cumberland Mountain. They were living together happily, and there did not seem to be any issues between the two of them. On Saturday, June 18, 1887, Henry Vanover was ambushed in his garden. Please see our article or video on the Henry Vanover story, Killing Rock, The Untold Tales, Part 2, for more information about the life and death of Henry. Also, see our story article or video on Clifton Branham, Killing Rock, The Untold Story, Part 5, for more information about Clifton's role in this murder and his time in the pen. Returning to the Clifton Branham Memoir. Clifton Branham claims that it was proven at his trial that he was at home with his wife when the shooting of Henry Vanover occurred. The next morning, a brother of Vanover's came to the property that Branham was staying at on his way to West Virginia. He asked Clifton to go with him on his journey. Clifton went as far as Clintwood in Dickinson County, Virginia, with him. Branham then left Vanover's company and continued on to Johnson County, Kentucky. While staying with one of his uncles on Tom's Creek, 3 men came and arrested him for the murder of Henry Vanover. They took him to the Letcher County Jail in Whitesburg, Kentucky to stand trial. Clifton's brother, Tandy, was also brought to the jail on some charge. Both men had their examining trial, was bound over, and sent to the Pike County Jail in Pikeville, Kentucky. After the trial, Clifton was found guilty and got a life sentence in the Kentucky State Prison at Frankfort. Time in the Kentucky State Prison at Frankfort. During Branham's incarceration at the Kentucky State Prison, he went to the library and got a Bible to read. He joined the Sunday school class, and he then joined the Royal Christian Brotherhood. He said he was happily converted, and he would pray in public, began preaching, and for the next 13 years continued with this work twice a day. He said that God had blessed him with this work. A new Kentucky law had passed in which everyone who had been incarcerated could be paroled after 10 years. After Clifton had been in prison for 14 years and 7 months, the deputy warden, Clifton, and his brother-in-law, William J. Fleming, all worked together for his release. The work paid off, and he was given parole and released. After giving his farewells, Branham boarded a train and went to Old Virginia. Home at last. On arriving at Norton, Virginia, Branham was met at the train station by his nephew, David Boggs. He went with Boggs to his house and stayed a week with him. This is how Branham describes that week. Quote, "While here surrounded with different environments and enchanting hills, I went up unto the mountains to pour out my soul to God in prayer. And oh, did I feel that if I had wings, I would flit away through the ethereal blue to brighter mansions beyond the skies." Unquote. Branham then received a phone message from Mr. Fleming, who had come to Coburn for him. He took the first train to Coburn to meet up with his nephew, who was there with horses to ride. They mounted the horses and rode to Dickinson County, arriving at William J. Fleming's home just after nightfall. They spent the remainder of the night and the next day talking and rejoicing together with friends over the release of Clifton. The next day, William J. Fleming and his wife, with Clifton, rode to Pound, Virginia. On the way, they stopped at John Branham's home, and there Clifton saw his mother, and they had a happy reunion of hugging and kissing each other, and they cried for joy at the reunion. They continued on with their journey to Webb Branham's home, and after greetings, Clifton played the organ, and they sang songs together and had a great time. Branham had sent for his wife and children to meet him there. Clifton's daughter Lizzie was the first to arrive. They hugged each other. Then Clifton recognized Nancy and shook her hand, and he asked the children to get her a chair. The two talked for a while. At some point, Clifton walked outside with Webb Branham's daughter, who was also named Lizzie, and the two were talking. Nancy came out and joined the two in their conversation. It soon turned sour. This is a direct quote from his memoir. Quote, "I went out to the lane and was talking, and my wife came out and joined in the conversation, and inadvertently she said, quote, 'Let's go home,' unquote. I said, 'Home? I have no home.' She said, 'Yes, you do.' I said to her, 'Nancy, look here. What a pretty daughter we have, and she looks just like a lamb that has been slain. And now I am just close to your house as I ever expect to be. Yet I am sorry such is the case, but you have drawn the line between us that can never be erased. You have helped to slay this child, and now I want you to let me take her and raise her feet out of the pit, into which you have gotten them. But if you should call on me for any accommodation, I should be glad to help you, and will never lay a straw in your way, if you will let me alone." Unquote. She denied nothing, and we parted just that way. About dark that night, Dave Fleming's wife came to Clifton telling him that, quote, "Paul Dave is out in the end of the garden, out by the road, and he wants you to come out. He wants to see you." Unquote. Clifton's sister and William J. Fleming both told him not to go, so he refused to meet with Dave. Dave and his party immediately left, and so Clifton said that he knew that something was up to no good at that point. Death of Nancy Branham. The next morning, Clifton and his daughter Lizzie made a trip to Dickinson County, Virginia, to the grave of Mima, to pay their respects. Clifton states while he was there in sad reflection, he had considered going back to live with his wife and forgiving her for everything. Never mind that he was the one that was moonshining, shooting people, went to prison, and taken up with other women as a single man named George Jones for years, but he's going to forgive her. All righty then. But after thinking upon this for some time, he refused to do so. The pair returned to Mr. Fleming's home, and he was invited to spend Christmas with some friends in Clintwood. But Clifton thought it was best to avoid trouble, as the parties were prone to drinking and drunken conduct. So instead, they went to Pound, Virginia. On the way, Dave Fleming overtook the traveling pair. Dave and Clifton had many difficulties before this point in their history. What follows is a word-for-word account of what Clifton wrote as to how Nancy Branham ended up being shot dead by him. Quote, I told him to go on, that I did not want to travel with him. He said, quote, no, I would not hurt you for $1,000, unquote. He said, quote, you know it would do you no good, you SOB. I then jobbed my gun in his face, and he struck me, and I shot at him. By this time my wife had come up and said, quote, you have killed my child, you SOB, and I will have your neck broke for it, unquote. She thought I had shot our daughter. Then she threw up my daughter to me. Then I fired the shot, and I left her lifeless on the ground, unquote. Then I left, crossing the mountain, going to my brother's on Shelby Creek. On reflecting over the matter, I wondered how my wife and daughter could rise up against me, and have me so soon cut off, and me to kill my wife. I never dreamed of such as ever happening, unquote. After being on Shelby Creek for a short time, he traveled to Beaver in Floyd County, Kentucky to stay with his cousin John McCurry. From here, we will let Clifton tell you what happened next. Quote, I went to Beaver in Floyd County to my cousin John McCurry's, where I remained about 3 months. He had a daughter with whom I fell in love. Her father could not stay at home because of a feud between him and the Moore family living just below him. They had shot him, killed his property, burned his barns and fencing, and kicked up all kinds of deviltry, and swearing that they would take his life before they let up. But it came to pass that Anderson Moore got killed, and that broke up the next. His property was killed, his house and barn were burned. Haley and I got married and started to Michigan, taking a boat at the mouth of Big Mud. A drummer on the boat knew me. He got off at Prestonsburg and told them that we had gone down the river. The others took a skiff and followed us to White House, where they arrested me and brought me back to Prestonsburg jail. Then they took me to Lexington, where I remained 2 months, and the officers from Virginia came after me and brought me here to Wise County Jail to be tried for the murder of my wife, unquote. Trial. During the July term of 1903, the Commonwealth of Virginia versus Clifton Branham commenced in the Wise County, Virginia court. Judge W. S. Matthews was presiding. Clifton's attorneys were Honorable R. P. Bruce, J. F. Alley, and J. A. Hughes. 12 men were selected for the jury, and after hearing the evidence, came back with a charge of guilty of murder in the first degree. Last confession, last request, hanging, funeral, and burial. The following is word-for-word confession of Clifton Branham. Quote, at the age of 14, I took deliberate aim and shot at Mrs. Fleming, and at another time I shot at John Fleming, intending to kill them for abusing my sister, but missed them. I beat another woman and threw her over a cliff, leaving her for dead, but she recovered. I premeditatedly shot to kill Rance Smallwood, but failed. I received part of the money that killed Henry Vanover. I killed my wife for accusing me of my daughter. I killed Anderson Moore and destroyed his property on Beaver. Last request as given by Clifton Branham. That my friends take me to Dickinson County for interment. Goodbye. Execution. Clifton Branham was led from Wise County Jail on September 25, 1903, and taken to the scaffold. He was the last man to be hanged in Wise County, Virginia. The funeral and burial. Branham's body was taken to Dickinson County by family members in a horse-drawn wagon. People came out all along the way to pay respects to Clifton's body as it passed by. Supposedly, Clifton said that he wanted a 3-day wake because he would rise again on the third day from the dead. Everyone waited anxiously for him to rise on up on that third day, but nothing happened. He was then laid to rest in an unmarked grave high on a knoll in the Branham family cemetery at the head of Pine Creek. So ends the memoir of Clifton Branham. Thank you. We at Kentucky, Tennessee Living would like to thank you for watching our video series on the Appalachian Outlaws. Don't forget to hit that like button, as the more likes we receive, the more likely YouTube is to suggest our videos to other viewers. Also, to receive notice when we upload a new video, be sure to subscribe and click the bell for notifications. We thank you for continuing to support Kentucky, Tennessee Living as we are discovering the mysteries of Appalachian history.